March of 1874 laid a pale light over Ember Ridge, the kind of dust-gold glow the West often wore when it seemed to sleep beneath the Lord's quiet hand. The wind carried the scent of pine sap and dry earth, brushing across the weathered fences. On the porch of a small cabin at the edge of town, Soren Wilder stood still, his back straight. His shadow stretched across the cracked ground. He waited, not with hope, only in the way a man waits after too many years alone. In the letter he sent to the matchmaker back east, he asked for a girl mild, untroubled, easy to live with, easy to talk to. Someone to fill the empty rooms and the darker spaces inside him. No one said it aloud, but all of Ember Ridge knew Soren had lost his voice after a gun accident 6 years earlier. Since then, silence had become a coat he wore through all 4 seasons. The rattle of wheels rose from the red dirt slope. Soren narrowed his eyes at the coach rolling toward the gate in a cloud of dust. His chest tightened, not from impatience, but from the uneasy sense of a man who knows he may have asked for something he himself never understood. The coach stopped. The driver climbed down, knocked on the side, and swung the door open. Dust cleared, and a figure stepped out. Not the young girl with neat braids and a bright, untested face the matchmaker had described. Not the light dress, nor the timid bearing of someone untouched by hardship. Instead, it was Zahara Lane. She stood there in a worn, dark dress frayed at the hem, clutching a soft, tired satchel as though it were the only thing she had left. Her deep brown skin caught the afternoon light, but it was her eyes, dark, hollow, and exhausted, that held Soren still. Not beautiful, no need for beauty. Only the eyes of someone who had known more loss than most. A wind swept past, lifting loose curls against her cheek. Zahara swallowed hard and looked straight at him. Her lips were cracked, yet her voice came low and steady enough to weigh down the air between them. "If I'm not what you expected, I can turn back." No pleading, no explanation, just a bare truth placed squarely in his hands. Soren meant to answer. He tried. His throat tightened, reaching for a sound he had not been able to make in 6 years. Only a rough breath rose behind his lips. He looked at her longer than he needed to, then stepped aside and opened the cabin door. Zahara lowered her head and walked past him. The hem of her dress brushed his fingertips, light as dust. Inside the cabin, the dimness lingered, though the afternoon light slipped through the gaps in the boards. Zahara stood at the threshold, letting her eyes adjust to a room with only a rough wooden table, a few uneven chairs, and a cold hearth. The scent of old timber and long-settled dust hung in the air, as if the place had waited too long for someone to open its door. She set down her satchel, her hands trembling from fatigue and something deeper. After days on the road, the thought of standing in a house with a stranger tightened her chest, but his eyes, quiet, unreadable, held no threat. They felt like untended ground that no longer remembered how to bloom. "Thank you," she whispered. She wasn't sure he heard, much less understood. Soren only nodded and glanced toward a water jug in the corner. He motioned with his hand, then tapped the stone counter, inviting her to pour herself a drink. Zahara lifted the jug. When she turned back, she hadn't expected him to be so close. Her hand brushed his, just a moment, but enough to make them both start. Setting the cup down, she searched for something to say, a bare thread of politeness between two strangers. "Have you lived here long?" she asked, voice low, as if sound might split the room apart. Soren parted his lips. Zahara saw his chest rise, his throat tighten, the exact effort of a man preparing to answer. But instead of words, A broken breath escaped. A sound caught halfway, like wind pressed against stone. He tried again. No voice followed. Zahara stilled, her head tilted, her dark eyes blinking once, surprise, then the brief halt of someone realizing her new life would be harder than she imagined. The moment was small, but clear enough to show the flicker of disappointment she wished she hadn't revealed. She swallowed it back at once. Soren looked away, pressed a hand to his throat, then touched the stone counter, an old, familiar gesture born of years spent in silence. Zahara understood too quickly. What disappointment remained slipped away, replaced by a soft ache for a man trying to speak to her, though his own body stood in the way. "You can't talk?" she asked gently. Soren nodded once, not sorrowful, not asking for sympathy, only stating the truth he had carried for 6 years. Zahara exhaled, a sound as soft as leaves falling. Something within her sank, not in fear, but in recognition. She knew too well what it was to lose one's voice, not the literal one, but the voice of dignity, of joy, of a past no one cared to ask if she survived. Then, Zahara smiled faintly, a small, sad curve. "I'll try to understand you in other ways." She didn't know why she said it. Perhaps it was his eyes, firm yet tired, the same eyes she had met in her own reflection for years. Soren lifted his gaze, holding hers a beat longer than before. In that look, Zahara felt something unusual, the quiet sense of sharing a secret no one else on earth knew. Evening settled slowly. Firelight flickered across the ceiling in uneven bands. Soren prepared the small back room for Zahara and lay down outside near the door. He did not lock it, did not latch it, yet the door remained slightly ajar, like a gesture of restraint. Zahara lay in the small bed, the rough blanket drawn over her shoulders. Though exhausted, she could not sleep. Beyond the door, his faint movements rose and fell like the night wind. She knew he sat somewhere in the dark, not watching her, but because stillness had become his only companion. The thought made her pull the blanket closer. A man silent enough to make darkness hesitate, yet not one who frightened her the way other men once had. Men who feared their own voices more than she ever did. Outside, Soren lay on his side, his back against the cold floorboards. He heard her breaths, long, slow, then broken like someone trying not to cry. Each time his throat tightened, unsure whether it was her sorrow he felt or the echo of nights he'd once lived through himself. On the second night, Zahara dreamed of blurred faces from her past, rumors clinging to her like mud. Black Widow, they had called her in the last town. One husband dead, then another, though the truth was far from simple. The whispers and wary glances had driven her inward until she became a shadow even she disliked. She woke with a start. A small sound came from the outer room. Soren was still awake. A thin line of lamplight slipped through the door, tracing the shape of him sitting against the wall, head bowed like a man afraid sleep might cost him something he could not name. Zahara pulled the blanket close, steadying her heartbeat. Maybe both of them were learning how to exist under the same roof, like two branches growing near each other, unsure how to touch without breaking. At dawn, Zahara stepped out. Soren was tending the fire. Morning light drew a warm line across his face, a softness she hadn't seen the day before. He turned, and for a moment they held each other's gaze. No avoidance, no unease. Just two lost souls recognizing something familiar. She nodded. He answered with a small tilt of his head. No words passed between them, yet the cabin felt less cold. And in the quiet of that Ember Ridge morning, they began to grow used to each other's presence, gentle as early mist, but enough to change the days ahead. Morning rose over Ember Ridge in a strange, glass-clear light. Spring wind drifted through, cool, not harsh, but sharp enough to make a person draw their shoulders in. Zahara stepped into the yard, tightening her thin scarf when she saw Soren bent over the loose hinge of the barn door. He worked slowly, but with certainty, large, calloused hands moving with the steady ease of breath itself. Only then did Zahara realize she had never stood this close to a man so silent that even the tap of his hammer sounded like a confession. "Let me help," she said softly, stopping beside him. Soren glanced at her, not resisting. He simply stepped aside and handed her a small wooden brace. She nodded, trying to keep the composure of someone who clearly wasn't used to heavy work. They worked in parallel like that, neither speaking, yet each time their hands brushed while passing a tool, Zahara felt her heartbeat falter. When they both bent down at the same moment to pick up a fallen nail, her forehead struck his, a soft, brief touch, but enough to make her throat tighten. Zahara pulled back instantly, cheeks burning. "I'm sorry. I wasn't looking." Soren didn't step away. He stopped only close enough that her breath still hovered in the space between them. His pale gray eyes held hers, not questioning, not accusing, simply attentive in a way that dried her lips. Zahara looked aside first, her heart stumbling. Soren, unbothered, slowly picked up the nail, though his fingers trembled, as if that small touch had shaken more than her. That night, the wind rose hard. The sky darkened into a dense mass, storm clouds rolling as if ready to swallow the ridge. Zahara sat in her room, but the wind howling through the roof sounded like a wild creature crying out, making her shiver. She pulled the blanket to her chest, yet her hands still shook. She had lived in houses where the wind mixed with shouting, sounds that struck at memories she wanted buried. Without thinking, she rose and stepped outside her room. Soren sat by the window, lamplight drawing soft lines across his face. He turned when he heard her. He didn't need to ask. Her fear was clear in her eyes. "The wind," she murmured. "It sounds like someone screaming out there." Soren set his tools aside, but didn't move too close. He only looked at her, asking with his eyes, "What do you need me to do?" Zahara tried to smile, tried to look strong, but the words escaped before she could stop them. "Could you sing something? Just so I'm not so scared." Soren froze. So did she. In that moment, everything she had tried to forget, his silence, his struggle, the old wound, rushed back. Zahara's face went pale as she lifted a hand to her mouth. I'm sorry. I forgot. I didn't mean—" He shook his head, light as dust falling off a coat. No blame, no sorrow, only a quiet resignation he knew too well. But his eyes, those eyes sinking just slightly, made her chest tighten. Trying to make it right, she sat down at a respectful distance, fingers interlaced. "Then let me sing," she said, voice trembling but sincere. "A song my mother used to hum when the wind turned rough." Zahara looked down at her palms, where faint calluses lingered from rushed labor. She drew a breath and began. The first notes trembled, then her voice warmed, smoothing like an old wool scarf pulled straight. A simple, old melody, soft enough to feel like the arms of someone she once called home. The wind still raged outside. But inside, her song stitched a thin thread through the broken silence of his life. Soren didn't move. His eyes stayed on her mouth, each note loosening the hard lines of his face. Something tender, calm, fragile. so quietly beautiful she almost stopped for fear of breaking him. She lowered her gaze, unsure if she should go on, but he, with one slow nod, earnest and almost pleading, asked her to continue. Zahara sang until her voice faded into the dark. When the song ended, the wind eased too, as if the ridge itself had been listening with him. For the first time in 6 years of silence, Soren Wilder didn't feel alone. And for the first time in a long while, Zahara Lane felt her voice was not just to soothe herself, but had reached another heart. That afternoon, the sky over Ember Ridge changed so fast, it made a person shiver. Dark clouds surged from the west, like a hunting pack sweeping toward the grasslands. The air thickened, carrying the scent of damp earth and cold wind. Warning of a storm even the prairie would have to bow before. Soren had just looked up when thunder ripped across the sky, followed by the frightened screams of the horses in the barn. He dropped his tools and ran toward them as heavy raindrops struck the roof like stones. Inside, the horses were in chaos. One tore free of its rope, another reared high, white-eyed, kicking hard against the wooden wall. The smell of fear, hot sweat, and the whistle of wind through the gaps all tangled into one force he could not command. He wanted to shout to calm them. In a moment of desperate instinct, he opened his mouth as if calling back a name he had lost long ago. But no voice came. Only the harsh, broken scrape of breath caught in his throat. Clutching the rail, Soren watched helplessly as the fear spread through the herd. One horse screamed and kicked the stall door loose. He lunged to catch it, but fear gave the animal more strength than he could match. Through the pounding thunder, he heard someone call his name across the yard. Then Zahara's figure burst into the barn like a thin streak of light in the storm. She wore the same dark, faded dress, her curls plastered to her rain-soaked face. Her breath came uneven, but her dark eyes held a grit that stunned him. Soren. He tried to motion for her to go back, not to come in, not into danger, but his hands shook, and his silent mouth betrayed him again. Zahara glanced at the thrashing horses, then stepped straight into the open space between them. Soren lunged to pull her out, but she raised her hand. "Let me try," she said, her voice trembling from cold and fear alike. If I don't do something, they'll hurt each other." And then, as if even the storm paused, Zahara parted her lips. She began to sing, clumsy, shaking, but still a song, an old lullaby from the far south, her voice weaving into the rain, thin, wavering, yet unbroken. The first notes faltered in the chaos, then slowly, steadily, softened the air like water soaking into dry ground. The horses eased. One lowered its head, blowing hard. Another stilled, its eyes still afraid, but no longer wild. Soren stood frozen. Lightning split the sky, casting her face in stark light. Rain slid along her skin like silver lines. Her tangled hair clung to her neck, and her dark eyes shone with a courage so gentle it cut through everything the storm clawed at. Her voice was not strong, but it went straight into his chest. A hidden hand struck a place that had been frozen for 6 years. A door opened. Pain rose, sharp, freeing all at once. Soren braced himself against the stall wall, bowing his head. His shoulders shook, not from fear, not from cold. For the first time since losing his voice, he cried. No tears fell, but his breath broke apart like earth splitting under weight. He pressed his forehead to the wooden door, trying to steady himself, but it was useless. Zahara stopped singing when she saw him weaken. She stepped toward him, her hand closing gently around his arm with no thought beyond keeping him upright. "Soren," she whispered. He looked up. The space between them was narrow, Their breaths mingled in the damp air of the storm. Her rain-soaked face, lit by a flash of lightning, stripped every defense he had left. He raised a hand to her cheek, a slow, trembling touch, like a man finding his way home, but afraid he might break the door as soon as he reached it. Zahara trembled too, not from the storm, but from something that had risen too fast, too real. They stood like that for several long breaths, enough to feel time pause outside the barn. Then both stepped back at once, suddenly, sharply, as if afraid they had crossed into something neither was ready to name. The storm still raged beyond the walls, but inside the Ember Ridge barn, another storm, quieter, deeper, had just begun. Morning settled quietly over Ember Ridge after the storm, but Zahara still carried the echo of the night before. The trembling song over thunder, the way Soren looked at her, the touch of his hand against her cheek. When he handed her a list of supplies, written in slanted chalk marks on his slate, she simply nodded to hide her unease. She wanted to do something for him, at least something small, at least prove she wasn't a burden. Pulling her shawl tighter, Zahara followed the damp dirt road toward town. The early sun glinted on the puddles like scattered salt, but it did little to chase away the cold that old memories left in her bones. The moment she stepped into the market, she felt the eyes on her. Quick glances, turned away, then turned back again as if to confirm a rumor. A woman whispered, "That's her. The twice-widowed one." Another answered with a sharp sniff, "They call her Black Widow. Just look at those dark, hollow eyes." Zahara lowered her head, pretending to study the flour sacks on the shelf to avoid their stares. She tried counting the coins in her hand, but the swarm of murmurs circled her like biting insects. When she paid for salt, a coin slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. Zahara bent to pick it up, but her hand shook, not from fatigue, but from feeling like the whole town saw her as some curiosity on display. Just then, something small and sharp struck her side. A pebble. Zahara froze. Behind her, children's laughter rang out. High, careless, but cutting all the same. "Black Widow! Black Widow's here!" She straightened, clutching the basket to her chest. Her eyes stayed dry, yet the rims burned as if scraped raw. She had thought she'd grown used to scorn, but she hadn't expected it to follow her so quickly to a new place. She turned away, ready to leave the market altogether, when the crowd suddenly grew still. A heavy, unnatural silence. Something had changed. She didn't understand why until she saw the broad figure moving toward her. Soren Wilder. He didn't rush. He didn't push through the crowd. He walked with slow, steady steps, as solid as the ridge rising behind the town. His shirt was still damp from morning mist, a few strands of hair wine-tossed, but his eyes were bright and cold enough to make people recoil without being told. Zahara froze. She hadn't expected him to come. She hadn't expected him to know. Soren stopped at the large wooden sign in front of the store, the one where folks wrote, "Flour left, 5 bags, today's price for beef," and so on. He snatched the chalk from the shopkeeper's hand and wiped the board clean with his palm. No one spoke. Then he wrote one word, large, firm, the chalk carved deep like it meant to cut through the wood. Enough. The scrape of chalk against the board rang out sharp and metallic, making the entire market hold its breath. Lifting the sign, Soren faced the crowd. His eyes moved over each person, not shouting, not threatening, but with a force that made every gaze drop, as though the earth itself had reprimanded them. Zahara stood still, gripping her basket, heart pounding, but not in fear. For the first time in years, someone stepped between her and the judgment aimed at her. Not with words, he had no words, but with an act as clear as sunlight on dust. When Soren turned back to her, his eyes didn't ask if she was hurt, nor did they try to comfort. They said only one thing: I am here. Enough that they will stop. In that moment, Zahara felt something she had nearly forgotten, the quiet certainty that she was no longer entirely alone, and that perhaps, just perhaps, someone had placed his heart beside hers, though neither of them dared call it anything yet. Darkness settled over Ember Ridge like a damp blanket, its cold seeping into every timber of the small cabin. Zahara had just coaxed the fire to life when the sound of hooves reached her. Distant at first, then closer, the kind of sound she had spent years trying to outrun. She rose abruptly. 3 mounted men stopped at the porch. At the center was the familiar face from her past, her late husband's kin, the man who once stood at a graveside and declared she was bad luck. Thickset, wrapped in a worn fur coat, he jabbed a finger toward the cabin. "We've come to take her," he barked, breath sharp with liquor. "She belongs in Kansas. No place else can stomach the trouble she brings." Cold swept through Zahara. They had found her after all. Before she could retreat, the door behind her swung open. Soren stepped out, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the ground. He said nothing, could say nothing, but the silence only made the confrontation cut deeper. The man sneered. "You think just because you can't talk, people will fear you? Move aside. Nothing good comes from a woman cursed the way she is." Zahara touched Soren's arm, trying to stop him, but he stepped forward, covering her completely. The lamp's faint glow struck his face just enough to show his gray eyes sharpen like steel. The man reached for her. Soren shoved back. No threats, no raised voice, only the steady force of a man who had endured too much to fear anything left. At last, the leader spat on the ground, furious. "Fine. We'll be back. Don't think you can hide her forever." As the hooves faded into the night, Zahara collapsed onto the porch, her body trembling as if the strength had drained from her bones. Soren crouched beside her, laying a hand on her shoulder, not as comfort, not as pressure, simply as something solid enough to keep her from breaking. The cold wind forced them to seek shelter elsewhere. The house no longer felt safe, so they crossed to the stable. Thicker walls, warm horses, the quiet pulse of breath in the dark. Under the small lantern's light, Zahara sat on a pile of dry hay. The space felt wide, yet heavy with everything unspoken. She wrapped her arms around herself. "No one has stood with me as long as you have," she said, her voice cracking in a way that startled even her. "They wait to blame me, blame my name. Blame things I never did." Tears finally fell, the tears she always forbade herself. Soren sat beside her, close enough that she felt his warmth, yet far enough she didn't feel trapped. Zahara lifted her gaze, dark eyes shining with pain. She reached for his neck, the place where the faint, pale scar still marked the day he lost his voice. "You don't need to speak," she whispered. "I still hear you." Soren froze, as though no one had ever touched that wound with such gentleness. Slowly, he raised his hand, cautious, almost afraid, and cupped her chin, drawing her eyes to his. Their breaths mingled. The wind outside faded into a distant murmur. Neither could speak aloud, but both knew a line had been crossed. When Zahara leaned toward him, it wasn't haste or hunger. It was the fall of a heart that had stood alone too long on the edge. Soren caught her, awkwardly, tenderly, like a man touching something fragile for the first time. His hand slid to her back, drawing her into the solid warmth of his chest. Their lips found each other in a trembling kiss, soft, honest, painful in its truth. Not possession, not desire. Just two souls, one silenced, one branded unlucky, finally finding a place where weakness did not need permission. They rested against each other on the hay in the quiet dark of the stable, their breaths slowing as if lulling each other back into life. That night brought no vows, no promises, only one simple truth, enough to change both their lives. Dawn came slowly the next morning, its light spreading over the prairie like a thin cloth, warming what the long night left behind. Bands of amber sunlight slipped into the stable, gliding over the dry hay before settling on Zahara's dark curls. She woke first. For a breath, she didn't know where she was. Then the warmth at her back made her go still. Soren lay close behind her, one arm around her waist, holding her the way a person holds something fragile enough to vanish with the opening of a hand. He had not let go all night. Zahara held her breath. Her heart beat quiet and steady, so different from the frantic rhythm of the years before. His breath, warm and low, brushed her nape, and she felt a strange sensation. Not fear, but shelter. Then the truth of last night flooded back. She rose carefully, trying not to wake him. But the moment she shifted, his arm tightened, not forceful, only enough to let her know he felt her slipping away. Zahara turned. His gray eyes were open, watching her in a silence so still it felt like a fear of breaking something delicate. They paused there, caught between the uncertainty of two people unsure whether the night had been a mistake, an accident, or something far larger. She lowered her gaze. Her voice was barely wind, a whisper almost lost beneath a horse's soft snort. "Do you regret it?" Soren lifted his brows, as if he didn't understand. She rushed on, fingers twisting together. "I don't want you to carry trouble because of me. Last night was just me being weak. If this morning you feel—" Before she could finish, Soren placed a hand lightly on her back, a touch so soft it felt like a leaf settling on cloth. A touch that stopped every word of self-blame. He spoke nothing, but the message was clear as day. He did not regret it, not one bit. Zahara looked up. His steady gaze met hers, and her heart stumbled again, startled by the way he could speak so fully without a single sound. When they returned to the cabin, morning mist clung to the roof, but whispers in town had arrived before they did. They say her husband's kin tried to drag her back. Must be something to those stories. Poor Soren. Why get tangled with that widow? Zahara heard every word like needles against her skin. Soren heard them too, his jaw tightening, though he didn't confront anyone. He only stepped closer, a hand resting at her back, a silent shield. She didn't cry, but her eyes dimmed, tired, sorrowful, familiar with being misunderstood. Inside the cabin, Zahara set her basket on the table and stood motionless for a long time. At last she turned to him. "Soren, I think I should leave." He straightened, eyes darkening. "Ember Ridge won't accept me. They'll only drag you down. You've already done too much for me." She walked to the door, her hand settling on the wooden latch. "If I go, all these rumors will fade. You can have the quiet life you had before." Soren stared at her so long she felt her knees weaken. She turned her face away to escape that gaze. Then a large, warm hand rested over hers on the latch. He closed his fingers. He held the door shut. He held her. Zahara's breath hitched. Soren, don't. You don't have to do this. He didn't reach for his slate. He didn't reach for paper. He only shook his head, slow, firm, as if confirming something he had known for a long time. She looked back at him. Then he tightened his grip on her hand, steady and resolute, offering her a wordless vow. He chose to stay. He chose her. And no one else would decide that for him. Zahara froze, eyes stinging, not from shame this time, but from the shock of someone finally refusing to let her walk away for fear of being burdened. They stood there in the small cabin, under the thin light of a new morning. Two people still trembling, still unsure, yet already stepping into a path neither wished to turn back from. Morning in Ember Ridge lay under a thin veil of mist, yet the air felt sharp as a blade. Zahara was hanging laundry on the porch when the ground began to tremble. Hoofbeats, heavy and many, rolling in from the distance like drums of mourning. She turned. A red plume of dust rose along the main road. There was no mistaking it. They had come back. Leading the group was Caleb Ward, brother of her second husband, broad-shouldered, his black coat swelling with each gust of wind. Beside him rode a gaunt lawyer clutching a stack of papers thick as a charge sheet, and behind them a hired gun in a dark hat, his hand hovering near his revolver. They stopped before the cabin. None dismounted. Caleb pointed straight at Zahara, his voice thick as mud. Last time I held back out of respect for this town. Not today. The girl's coming with us. Time she restored the Ward family's honor. Zahara stepped back on instinct, her shoulder hitting something solid. Soren. She didn't know when he had come outside, only that he now stood behind her, his height covering half her frame. Caleb sneered. Another fool falling for her, just like the last two. Zahara's breath lodged in her chest. The words, the accusation she had lived under for years, tightened around her like a clasp. But before fear could spread, she felt Soren's hand rest lightly on her back. Not stroking, not pulling, just placed there, steady enough for her spine to straighten. The lawyer lifted the papers high. We possess evidence that Miss Zahara Lane left Kansas unlawfully. She must return with us to give her account. Soren stepped forward half a pace, blocking her entirely from their view. The hired gun narrowed his eyes, hand poised near his weapon. Friend, step aside. This ain't your business. Soren did not move, not an inch. His gaze hardened like stone, and something in that silence made Caleb's fingers twitch on the reins, an instinctive recoil from a quiet that belonged not to the weak, but to a man already prepared to die before backing down. Dust swirled around the horse's legs. The air thickened, waiting for a spark that could split the morning open. Zahara trembled, not from Caleb, but from the fear that Soren might pay a price for her. Yet instead of hiding behind him as she once would have, she stepped forward a single pace, standing close enough that her breath brushed his coat. In that moment, Soren tilted his head a fraction, an acknowledgement of her message. She was not running, and he stood firmer for it. Caleb clenched the reins, voice dropping like falling stone. Move, mute. She belongs with us. The more you cling, the worse it'll be. Zahara opened her mouth to say she belonged to no one, but Soren reached back, fingertips brushing her wrist. Not to silence her, only to say, "Let me." His hand slipped to his belt, resting on his revolver. Every sound in town vanished. The wind stopped. The horses stiffened. Even the birds on the telegraph wire went quiet. The hired gun shifted instantly, ready to draw, but Soren didn't pull his weapon. He only placed his hand there, firm, bare, without hesitation. Caleb scowled. What's that supposed to mean? You planning to start shooting in front of half the town? Still no answer. Only the look in Soren's eyes. No one touches Zahara Lane while he stands. The lawyer lowered the papers, glancing nervously around as townsfolk began to gather. Curious faces shifted to cautious ones, no one eager to be near if bullets started flying. Zahara stood behind him, fingers knotted together but her gaze steady. For the first time, she faced her late husband's family without lowering her head. She wasn't alone anymore. Caleb jerked the reins, growling, "We'll be back," with a proper warrant. And next time, he swept his eyes up and down Soren. Not even a mute will save you. The three horses turned, leaving a long trail of red dust down the road. That morning, Zahara and Soren walked into town to buy cloth and tobacco for the horses. The dirt road to Ember Ridge still held a soft shine after last night's storm, puddles glinting as if the world had settled back into peace. Zahara walked slowly, her heart weighted. Soren kept pace beside her, long strides measured, leaning into the wind now and then to shield her. They were silent, but it was no longer the silence of strangers, lighter now, closer, like two breaths learning the same rhythm. But as they neared the small town square, Zahara sensed something wrong. People stood lined along the street. No laughter, no chatter. The air tight as a bowstring drawn too far. Then, from the center of the crowd, 3 horses emerged. Caleb Ward led them. Her late husband's brother, the man who had sworn to drag her back by any means, sat stiff-backed in the saddle, eyes red with a sleepless hatred. To his left rode the lawyer, papers tucked into his coat. To the right, the hired gun, hand already near his revolver. Zahara froze. Dust filled her throat like sand. Soren stepped ahead of her at once, a natural reflex, blocking her from their sight. Caleb lifted his chin, projecting his voice so all of Ember Ridge could hear. Zahara Lane, you're coming back to Kansas. Today. The lawyer lifted the papers, reading them like a sentence. You are charged with fleeing after the death of your husband. You must return with us for further investigation. Zahara stepped back, but Soren reached behind him, brushing her hand. A light touch that said, "Do not be afraid. I am here." Caleb saw it and gave a crooked smile. Another man blinded by her, just like the last 2. Zahara stiffened. Those words, those accusations, had followed her for years like a curse. Soren straightened, gray eyes sharpening like tempered steel. The square fell silent, the wind scraping against the rooftops the only sound. The hired gun shifted his hand. A townsman shouted, "Wait!" But it was too late. A gunshot cracked through the air. White smoke burst from the revolver, drifting backward on the wind. Soren jerked forward. No one understood at first. No one breathed. He fell to the ground in the center of the square, dust rising around him like invisible blood. Zahara screamed, but the sound caught in her throat. She ran toward him, but then a fresh scream tore through the crowd. A horse, panicked by the gunshot, bolted. A small boy fell in its path, too frightened to move. Voices erupted. "The child! Grab him! There's no time!" No one acted fast enough, except Zahara. She ran, without hesitation, without a backward look, her feet barely touching the dirt. Her dress tore against the ground, her curls breaking free from her scarf, but she never slowed. She dove, wrapped her arms around the boy, and twisted her body to shield him. The horse reared, its hooves slicing the air inches from their heads, one breath away from crushing them both. Zahara hit the ground hard, pain flashing white. Blood pooled from her shoulder, But the boy lay untouched in her arms, screaming only from fear. A stunned silence washed over the square. The mother rushed forward, gathering her child, voice shaking. "She saved him. She saved my boy." The eyes that had judged Zahara for weeks turned to her now, shocked, shaken awake, stripped of their certainty. Zahara didn't stay to be thanked. She staggered up, nearly collapsing, and ran to Soren. He lay on his side in the dirt, his shirt darkening with blood, breath faltering. When she knelt beside him, her hands shook too violently to press the wound. "Soren, look at me. Please, don't close your eyes." Tears fell, striking his cheek. He opened his eyes, heavy, struggling, but trying to stay. His large hand lifted, wavering, searching for hers. Zahara caught it, pressed it to her face, her voice breaking. "You stood in front of them for me. Now please, don't leave me." A child saved. A man fallen for her. A town witnessing the truth it had refused to see. She did not bring death. She brought courage, and he had fallen because he loved her in a way he could never speak aloud. The afternoon wind of Ember Ridge cut sharp, carrying the cry of the land with it. Soren lay on a makeshift stretcher the townsfolk had spread across the road. Blood seeped from his chest in slow, dark drops, each one like a word struggling to speak for the voice he had lost 6 years ago. Zahara knelt beside him, cradling his head in her shaking hands, her lips trembling too hard to form a full prayer. People gathered around them, faces that once doubted her, whispered about her, avoided her, now looking at her with something wholly different. A man murmured, "The girl saved my boy. I won't let anyone lay a hand on her now." A woman, still shaking, whispered, "In all my years, I've never seen someone run into a wild horse like that." Their voices spread through the crowd, like a flame racing across dry grass. Then the crowd parted as Caleb Ward rode in again, the hired gun at his side, hand resting on his weapon as if wanting to end it quickly. But this time, Ember Ridge did not bow. The blacksmith stepped forward. One hand held his hammer, the other pointed at Caleb. "Enough. We won't let this town be your place of settling grudges." A storekeeper added sharply, "You spilled blood here once already. Leave." The hired gun looked around, startled. People who once kept silent now stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a wide ring that barred him from coming near Zahara or Soren. "Let peace return to Ember Ridge," an elderly woman said, her gaze sharp as a blade. "And leave that girl alone." Caleb's face burned red, but faced with the entire town, he understood the tide had turned. With a few curses, no one bothered to answer. He jerked his reins and wheeled his horse away into the dry wind. Only when the dust settled did Zahara dare to look down at Soren. He was breathing, but shallowly, painfully, as if every breeze tried to pull him away from her. "Soren, can you hear me?" Her voice cracked, threaded with fear and despair. His hand twitched, a small, faint movement, barely real, yet enough to tear her heart open. She lifted his hand, pressed it to her cheek, streaked with tears she could no longer hold back. "Please don't leave me. Not after everything." Her breath mingled with his fragile one. And then, in a moment Ember Ridge would later speak of as something near impossible. Soren Wilder opened his eyes, gray eyes clouded with pain, yet carrying a stubborn will that refused to dim. He looked at Zahara for a long time, as though memorizing her face in case this was the last time he saw the light. He tried to speak. His throat tightened. A broken sound escaped him, sharp enough to twist his face in agony. Don't push! It'll hurt you!" Zahara cried, her hands trembling as they held his face. But he still tried. And then, like a rope snapping free from 6 years of silence, a rough sound tore from the ruined scar of his throat. Zahara. The entire town went still. Zahara froze, her heart halting in her chest. He drew another breath, ragged, torn, almost drowned by his own blood, yet he forced another word out. "Stay." Just one word. A plea. A voice cracked and weak, but enough to set the sky over Ember Ridge aflame. Zahara lifted both hands to her mouth, a sob breaking free. She bent down, holding him close, pressing her lips to his bloodied hand as though anchoring him to the world. Around them, the crowd fell into complete silence. Someone whispered, "Dear God, he spoke. The mute man spoke for her." Zahara held him tightly, her voice shaking apart. "I'm here. I'm here. Soren, don't leave me. Please don't." Soren didn't answer again. His eyelids trembled, then closed, but his breath, thin, fragile, still held on, clinging like a single thread between life and death. And the woman once branded as ill-fated wrapped her arms around the man who had spoken for her with the last strength he possessed. That night, all of Ember Ridge knew. It was not fate that bound them. It was love. Dusk settled over Ember Ridge like a honey-colored cloth, draping the rooftops, the dirt roads, and the small cabin where two people fought to pull life back from the edge of darkness. The townsfolk had carried Soren home. They brought herbs, cloth bandages, hot water. The blacksmith even built a wooden frame to keep his head raised. No one said a word, yet all remained, quiet, attentive, as if repaying Zahara for what she had done for them. When the cabin door closed, only she and he remained, held together by the soft glow of oil lamps. The first days were hell. Soren burned like fire. Each breath cut his throat like a blade. Zahara pressed warm cloths to his chest, hour after hour, wiped the sweat from his brow, steadied him when fever seized his body. She barely slept. Every night she sat on the wooden chair beside his bed, her head leaning against his arm, speaking fragments of stories, tales from childhood, verses her aunt used to read, small dreams she had never dared to admit aloud. "You don't have to answer," she whispered, voice as thin as smoke. "Just listen. Just stay." When fever made him clutch the sheets, she slid her hand into his, letting him grip to ease the pain. When delirium pulled him away, she pressed her cheek to his brow, her breath guiding him back. When he trembled, she wrapped her small frame around his arm, as if her warmth alone could bring him out of the dark. And every night, she called his name softly, like a prayer. "Soren, come back." Then one morning, with the sky barely touching dawn, Soren opened his eyes. Not the half-conscious flutter of the previous days. He opened them fully, clearly, like a man returning from a journey far too long. Zahara was changing the bandage on his chest. Feeling his gaze, she froze, her whole body tensing. Then she looked up. Their eyes met. He tried to move his lips. He lacked the strength for words, but a low, broken syllable escaped. Small, rough, yet enough to make her heart clench. "Sa-ha!" She burst into tears at once. But unlike the tears of despair, these came from relief, from knowing he had returned to this world, returned to her. "I'm here," she whispered, taking his hand, pressing it to her cheek. "I'm right here." In the days that followed, Soren woke more often. He began practicing single sounds, single small words. His voice was torn, dry, scraping like stone on stone, but every syllable was a victory. Zahara was endlessly patient. She let him watch the movement of her lips before he repeated it. She spoke slowly, clearly, gently, as if teaching a child to speak for the first time. One afternoon, sunlight streamed through the window, laying a warm gold across his face. Soren called her, not with broken fragments. He said her name. Slowly, heavily, painful yet whole. Zahara. She froze. Her name, spoken in the voice he had lost for 6 long years, became the first confession of love, the only one she needed. She sat beside him, her fingers trembling as they touched his cheek. That is the most beautiful way anyone has ever said my name. Soren said nothing more. He simply lifted his hand, found hers, and laced their fingers together. His gaze softened, deep and warm, as if telling her everything words could never hold. They did not rush promises. They did not speak of futures or debts or fate. They simply stayed beside one another in the tender silence, in the steadier rhythm of his breath, in the nights when she read beside his bed, in the mornings when he looked at her as though life itself was beginning to grow again inside his chest. And from that moment on, neither heart was lonely anymore. A year had passed since the gunshot shook Ember Ridge. A year of quiet mornings, evenings spent reading by lamplight, and long days in which Zahara and Soren rebuilt their lives piece by piece. A new porch roof, a sturdier barn, and 2 hearts once shattered slowly, finding a steady, peaceful rhythm again. That summer, sunlight fell over the prairie like a soft gold ribbon stretching toward the horizon. On the cabin porch, the people of Ember Ridge gathered. Not many, not loud, just enough that Zahara could look around and know each one had a reason to stand there. The shopkeeper straightened the bundle of wildflowers in Zahara's hands. The blacksmith adjusted a chair on the porch, nodding with quiet pride. A few children darted across the yard. Among them, the boy who had nearly died beneath a horse's hooves, now standing beside his mother, watching Zahara with a gaze clear as gratitude etched into time. Soren waited on the porch, a plain white shirt, sleeves rolled to show the strength that had slowly returned after the injury. He turned a wooden ring in his hands, a gift he had carved on nights when Zahara slept beside him, each groove a silent promise, each fallen shaving a small fear he let go. When Zahara stepped forward, the wind lifted the hem of her pale cream dress. It wasn't expensive, nor bright, just soft fabric she had sewn herself in spare hours, yet in the sunlight, it glowed like the breath of summer. Soren looked at her as though seeing daylight for the first time. His hand trembled when he reached out, not from fear, but from the enormity of what stood before him. The woman who had pulled him back from the dark. The one who had spoken his name before he believed he still lived. Zahara placed her hand in his. A small gesture, yet both hearts shifted at its weight. The old minister began, his voice low. Weddings need few words, only 2 hearts knowing what they mean to say. And Soren, who had spent 6 years in silence, took a deep breath. He looked straight into her dark, gentle eyes, where so much sorrow had once lived, and where love now took its place. Then he spoke. No trembling, no faltering, no fear. 3 words, clear as light carved from stone. I love you, Zahara. The town fell so still they could hear the whisper of grass beyond the yard. A few people wiped tears. The boy's mother bowed her head in quiet thanks. And Zahara, once called the Black Widow, stood with eyes shining and a soft smile that rose like morning sun. She wrapped her arms around him, resting her forehead against his. I've loved you. For a long time. For a moment, even the wind seemed to pause, giving space to 2 people once broken by life, now standing whole in a wedding simpler and more beautiful than either had dared to imagine. That autumn, the first cry of a newborn sounded inside the Wilder cabin. A small baby girl, skin warm as honey, soft curls pressed to her mother's chest. Zahara named her Amara Wilder, the one who brings gentleness. Soren held her for the first time, his hands unsteady, eyes bright as if someone had set a flame inside him. Zahara leaned her head on his shoulder, listening to the quiet breath of the two souls she loved most. That evening, the sun lowered over Ember Ridge, casting honey-gold light across the fields, the rooftops, the man cradling his child, and the woman resting against him. The wind passed over the porch, but this time it carried away none of their warmth. This was home, their home, a home for two hearts once torn apart, now mended in love. If this story brings to mind someone who once held your hand through hard days, or a peaceful moment you thought you'd forgotten, please share it in the comments. I'd love to hear your memories, and if this journey warmed your heart even a little, please like, subscribe, and leave a blessing for the Wilder family. Thank you for staying. Your presence is a gift more precious than anything I could ever put into words.